Prince Harry landed back in the UK, but this time, there was a different kind of buzz surrounding his arrival. Was this a peace mission? A chance for reconciliation with his family? Or was it just another publicity stunt? Another moment to keep himself in the headlines? The air was thick with speculation. Would Harry sit down with King Charles to mend fences? Or would he take another swing at his brother, Prince William? But things took an unexpected turn. Instead of making headlines for some dramatic family meeting, Harry found himself in a much more unusual situation. He was at the Well Child Awards, an event meant to honor the bravest and most resilient young people across the UK. It was here that Harry met Declan, a 17-year-old who had a story that could easily steal the spotlight. At just 6 years old, Declan had survived one of the most terrifying medical events imaginable, Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It ravaged 96% of his skin, hair, and nails, leaving him with just a 20% chance of survival. Against all odds, Declan didn't just survive. He came out stronger, more resilient, and full of life. This was a young man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up, learning to walk again, read again, and live again. This wasn't just any teenager Harry was about to meet. Declan was a true survivor, someone whose strength was beyond compare. The moment Harry shook hands with him, you could feel the weight of the encounter. Harry wasn't just meeting a teenager. He was standing face to face with a living, breathing symbol of resilience. But what happened next? That's when things took a strange turn. You'd think a moment like this, meeting a young man who had literally fought for his life, would be one of dignity, a time for respect and admiration. But Harry somehow managed to turn it into something else entirely. He opened the conversation with a joke about Declan's sight impairment. He said it was probably a good thing Declan couldn't see him because of his ginger hair and, to be fair, a pretty scruffy beard. Now, maybe Harry thought he was being lighthearted, maybe he was trying to break the ice, but let's be real, this wasn't the time. The Well Child Awards weren't about him or his quirky facial hair. It wasn't the right moment to make light of someone's impairment, especially when you're talking to a teenager who's overcome far more than most adults ever will. The room was silent, uncomfortable even. And as the awkwardness set in, Harry probably didn't even realize how out of place his attempt at humor was. But it didn't stop there. Harry, clearly not reading the room, continued digging. He asked Declan if he had any siblings. Declan, in his calm and collected manner, said he had a younger brother who was almost 15. What did Harry say next? A casual, "Does he drive you mad?" No preamble, no sensitivity, just a straight-up invitation for Declan to start complaining about his brother. It was a bizarre question, and to anyone watching closely, it seemed like Harry was fishing for something. Validation, maybe. Validation for the deep resentment he's been carrying towards his own brother, Prince William. It's almost as if Harry was trying to find a piece of Declan's experience that could mirror his own relationship with William. But there was a problem. Declan wasn't biting. Harry wasn't done yet. He pressed on, clearly hoping to stir up something, anything, that could connect to his own deep-seated frustration. After all, here was a young man who had gone through hell and come out the other side stronger. If anyone could understand Harry's struggles, surely it would be Declan, right? But Declan wasn't giving him what he wanted. When Harry threw out the "Does he drive you mad?" line, Declan didn't play along. Instead, he simply said, "No, we get along fine. We're like friends." It was an answer that wasn't just polite. It was a direct contradiction to the bitterness Harry had been desperately trying to surface. And that right there was the turning point. Harry's emotional house of cards came crashing down. The very anger and resentment he had been clinging to for years was immediately rejected. Declan wasn't just offering a nice answer, he was rejecting the narrative that Harry was so desperately trying to validate. There was no fight between siblings, no drama, no rivalry, just two brothers who got along well, like friends. This wasn't just a small thing. For Harry, it was a reality check. For years, he'd been painting his older brother William as the villain. He'd written books, given interviews, and produced documentaries all centered around the pain of being the spare. He'd been clinging to his own narrative of sibling rivalry, but Declan, who had every reason to harbor resentment, was showing him a completely different way to see family. And it was uncomfortable. It was like hearing someone say they enjoy airplane food, or that they actually liked dial-up internet. It just didn't fit with Harry's narrative. At this point, the contrast between Harry and Declan couldn't have been starker. While Harry scrambled, Trying to force a connection to his own family turmoil, Declan remained composed, calm, and unbothered. Every time Harry tried to lead the conversation into familiar, painful territory, Declan simply responded with quiet confidence, as if he hadn't been affected by the same things Harry had spent years brooding over. Harry, clearly searching for something to validate his feelings, couldn't help but ask about school, thinking maybe there'd be another contrast to exploit. "Do you and your brother go to the same school?" he asked, clearly hoping Declan would say something about sibling rivalry. But Declan just replied, "Yes, we go to the same school. No, it's not weird." With each simple, matter-of-fact response, it became clearer. Declan wasn't a victim. He wasn't wallowing in bitterness or regret. He wasn't looking for sympathy or trying to paint his brother as a rival. Instead, he spoke about his brother like someone who genuinely cared for him, someone who saw family as a partnership, not a competition. It was as though Declan was showing Harry, without even trying, what it really meant to have a sibling you could rely on, someone you didn't have to resent, someone who had your back. The emotional weight of that hit hard, especially for someone like Harry, who had spent years playing out his own pain for the public. Declan wasn't perfect. He had been through unimaginable suffering, and yet his responses were grounded in something far more stable than what Harry could muster. In just a few words, Declan showed Harry that family could be something different, something free from resentment. And that realization, however fleeting, had to sting. As the conversation continued, it was impossible not to sense that something deeper was happening inside Harry. There was no dramatic confrontation, no verbal sparring, but there was a shift. For a man who had spent the better part of a decade painting his own family, especially his brother William, as villains in every book, interview, and Netflix special, hearing Declan speak so calmly about family must have been jarring. Declan's grounded, almost effortless perspective on his sibling relationship probably reminded Harry of something he'd lost, or perhaps never fully had. Harry was used to seeing family as something fraught with competition, emotional scars, and unresolved conflicts, but Declan wasn't looking for drama. He wasn't desperate to prove a point or air dirty laundry. He simply had peace, a peace Harry had yet to find. It was clear Harry wasn't just talking to Declan, he was talking to himself, projecting his own unresolved emotions onto this young man. Declan wasn't feeding into Harry's need for validation, and in that silence, Harry had no choice but to confront the reality of his own emotional state. Was his relentless pursuit of justice against his family really about healing? Or was it just a way to keep his pain alive, to keep himself at the center of the story? In that moment, Harry's inner turmoil seemed impossible to ignore. Every word from Declan, every simple, honest response, exposed the fact that Harry was still clinging to his past, still fighting battles that had long been lost. And as Declan stood there, unaffected and steady, Harry's emotional armor slowly cracked. What's truly tragic in this moment isn't just the awkwardness of the conversation. It's what it reveals about Harry. As Declan, a 17-year-old who had survived unimaginable hardship, stood confidently and calmly, Harry's emotional struggles were laid bare. In a room full of true bravery and resilience, Harry couldn't escape the shadow of his own pain. Despite being surrounded by heroes, his focus remained on himself, his narrative of victimhood, and the drama of his broken family. Declan wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't looking for anyone to validate his suffering. He had lived it, survived it, and moved on. His life, his attitude, and his presence spoke for themselves. Yet Harry, with all the luxury and privilege he had, still seemed unable to do the same. He was trapped in a loop of seeking sympathy, desperately trying to turn his wounds into a form of currency. It's almost as if Harry's entire public persona, his books, interviews, and documentaries were built around keeping that pain alive. But here was Declan, a young man who had every reason to hold on to resentment, yet chose to move forward with kindness and humility. The contrast was jarring, but more than that, it was revealing. In a brief encounter, Harry's deepest struggles were exposed not by a confrontation, but by the simple honesty of a teenager who refused to indulge in his pain. The real tragedy here isn't the headlines or the gossip. It's that Harry, even when surrounded by true courage, couldn't stop looking for validation in his own suffering. And as long as he continues to do that, he might never find the peace that someone like Declan already has. As Harry walked away from that conversation, there was no grand confrontation, no viral moment to fuel the media frenzy. Just a quiet, undeniable truth that hung in the air. He had been outclassed. Not by a duke, not by a politician, but by a 17-year-old boy in a suit who had every reason to be bitter, yet chose joy instead. Declan's life wasn't a story of complaints, drama, or seeking validation. It was the story of someone who had fought for his life and found peace on the other side. Harry, on the other hand, despite his royal status and all his opportunities for healing, still seemed to be caught in an endless cycle of self-victimization. In a room full of heroes, Harry had somehow found a way to make himself the victim yet again. But here's the kicker. Declan probably had no idea what he had just done. He didn't set out to challenge Harry or call out his emotional manipulation. He was just being honest. And that honesty, that quiet confidence, spoke volumes. It was a brutal mirror for Harry to look into, one that exposed the flaws in his narrative. In the end, this wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about two very different approaches to life. One defined by resilience and quiet strength, the other by a constant search for sympathy and validation. Declan didn't need to say much, because his presence alone was enough to reveal the truth. And for Harry, that truth was more cutting than any headline could ever be.